Great, thank you, and thank you, Austin. Okay, we'll move quickly on to our next speaker, Tony Duffin, who's going to be looking at, I don't know if we're here in front of me, HIV, stigma, social inclusion, and addiction. Is that right? Yes. In Ireland, very important. Tony Duffin is the CEO at the Liffey drug project, where he leads out on the design, delivery, and provision of low-threshold health services for people with complex and multiple needs, such as polydrug use, street homelessness, mental and physical health problems, and isolation. He's been a leading campaigner for the introduction of medically supervised injecting centres for Ireland. So, Tony, you're very welcome.
Thanks. It's very difficult to talk after Austin. I know him well. He's the most able person I've ever met. I never think of him as disabled. I just want to say this. One day we were getting a plane at Dublin Airport, and he asked me if I'd push him in a wheelchair. And I was mortified, but he was so happy that he didn't have to walk the full distance. But I was like, sorry about this. But anyway, he's a great guy, and he's also a Paralympian. He's got a PhD. I have got none of those things. But, you know, I've done other things. So, I am... Put that down. So, yeah, I'm Tony Duffin. I'm the CEO of the Liffey Drug Project. I'm very proud to say that. It's a great service. It's a great team that I work with there. We provide a low-threshold harm reduction service, as Richard mentioned. What does that mean? Well, we work with people who have some very difficult problems. Just to give you a sense of it, we work with people who are polydrug users, predominantly in their mid-20s to mid-30s, experiences of trauma related to things like criminal activity, violence, kidnapping, sexual assault, intimidation. There's family trauma, bereavement, sex work, both male and female, dangerous injecting practices, which leads to bloodborne viruses, of course, HIV and hepatitis C, etc. Isolation, people are very isolated, even if living in Dublin City. You know, it can be very isolated, but we also work in the Midwest of Ireland, and if you're living in the rural areas, social isolation in terms of geographical isolation is a serious issue, especially if you're using drugs. And suicide and self-harm. We work a lot with people with problems around suicide and self-harm. The stats are very clear that people who use drugs and alcohol, it's associated to both ways, to suicide and self-harm. We were established in 1982, and I noted from someone's, I was on Twitter earlier, I noticed someone mentioned, I don't know if it was Niall or Susan, but someone mentioned that we were part of an early responders in 1983 to the issue of HIV. And thanks for the mention. Frank Brady set the service up back in 1982, and we were incorporated in 1985. And we've been working with people to engage with them, because if you have got a relationship with people, you have nothing. So that premise of engaging with people is really important to us. We provide direct services, as I say, in Dublin and the Midwest, and we provide services online because, you know, things are changing and people are getting information in different ways. So engaging with people online is really important. We manage drugs.ie on behalf of the HSE, and we have our own website and other Twitter platforms and Facebook platforms and things like that. But in terms of working with people, I just want to say that we work on fixed site and outreach basis. We provide things like assertive outreach, needle and syringe programs, assertive case management, hostel in-reach, prison work, medical services, open access or drop-in services, treatment options groups, case management. I'm listing all these because people think we just want to allow people to take drugs because we campaign for medically supervised injection centres. When you work in harm reduction, the first thing you do is keep people safe, and then you work with them around their goals to find ways to help them to achieve their goals. And the team at the Liffey do far more than simply allow people to come in. You know, we do a lot of hard work, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. So today, just want to talk about focusing on street-based injecting. Just focusing in on it because, I'll explain why in a moment. Feedback from staff and people who use Liffey services, particularly around HIV and stigma. And then I want to talk to you about zombies and junkies. Most of you will know what that's going to be about. And then I want to talk about harm-reducing and rehabilitative approach to the possession of small amounts of drugs, illegal drugs in Ireland. And I'll explain why I want to talk about that when I get to it. But just for now, if I can just focus in on street-based injecting. Drugs is a big topic, okay? It's a broad topic, and you could talk about all sorts of different types of drug taking and different types of populations. But obviously, we work with a group of people who are particularly marginalised. So, you know, street-based injecting is unsafe and carries an elevated risk for a range of health harms. And for example, sharing of injecting paraphernalia is a leading cause of blood-borne virus transmission. To put these risks broadly in context, new HIV infections are increasing amongst people who inject drugs in Ireland, and particularly in the Dublin region. Between 2012 and 2014, there was a 68% increase in new HIV diagnosis amongst people who inject drugs, from 12 in 2012 to 27 in 2014. One of the things that we did in response to that was to work with HIV Ireland on the Snowblow campaign Ask. And that was around June of 2016. We finally were able to put that out, and that was to try and address to educate people around the risks of snowblow and the increase and the spike in HIV. I suppose just to say more broadly, it is worth noting that at the end of 2009, there were 5,369 diagnosed HIV cases in Ireland, of which 1,447, or 27%, were probably infected through injecting drug use. The majority of these cases reported injecting drug use as the main risk factor. According to the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, Ireland is one of the few countries that is not following the trend of decline for new HIV infections in the injecting community. They report that from 2014 to 2015, there were a total of 491 new HIV cases, with 50 related to injecting drug use. This is a sharp increase on previous years, and the reasons for this are still being examined. And I say that because there was, you know, it's interesting because when you have a spike, you think you know what's going on, but then when you start to pull back and have a look, there's different reasons for the infections. But broadly speaking, we do think it was to do with snowblow back in 2014. So the contraction of HIV through intravenous drug use, and particularly with regard to street-based injecting, remains a significant risk. Although I would say that if it wasn't for the efforts of health promotion campaigns and harm reduction interventions with people who inject drugs, the situation would be worse. For example, the World Health Organization are very clear that needle and syringe programs are a very effective way of reducing the contraction of HIV within a population. So harm reduction works. That's one important thing to say. So I was very lucky. The team gave me feedback, and the service users gave me some feedback, and I've boiled it down to a few bullet points. I hope I do them justice. But HIV treatment is generally accessible. That was feedback from staff and clients. Treating people with dignity and respect is essential. People will engage better with their treatment when they don't feel they are being judged, and Austin was giving examples of that earlier. People with chaotic lifestyles struggle with appointments and must be helped to maintain contact with their doctors and with the medication regime. So, you know, we can help with that. Services that provide case management or key working and psychosocial supports working with medics can help with that. People from other countries may not be aware of the services on offer. So we know that we have different languages, leaflets in different languages. It's just something to acknowledge that we've got to keep on top of that, and communication is essential as the years go by. We must keep refreshing things and thinking about getting the message to people. Access to testing for HIV is good. One of the pieces of feedback was it should be targeted increasingly at the most at-risk people who use drugs. So it's not that it isn't targeted, it just needs to be increasingly targeted. SafetyNet does work on that, and so does HIV Ireland. So that was a good feedback. More people are comfortable with getting tested for HIV, but there are still some who are not. And I think that's kind of obvious, really. You know, it depends on the person and their circumstances. People said that if they were in a stable relationship, they would maybe more likely to get tested to find out, so they can protect the other person and that kind of thing. But I think, you know, it's kind of human nature. Maybe if you're in a particular point in your life, you don't really want to know what's going on with your health. You just want to put your head in the sand. So there's a little bit of change there. There is less stigma attached to a HIV diagnosis nowadays. It doesn't mean that there is no stigma attached, it just means there is less. One of the I keep hearing, it's interesting today, I keep hearing stories about in days gone by, you know. Someone was just explaining to me about drug users being rounded up to be tested en masse back in the day. You know, that's shocking. And I didn't know. So I think there's a piece of work there to sort of write that stuff down and remember what it was like. But a HIV diagnosis does carry some stigma, but not nearly as much as it did 20 plus years ago. People have told us stories of being treated by medics in hazmat suits in the early days of HIV. There is less stigma attached, although it can be used against you in an argument or a fight. Which brings me on to point 5, which is people refer to HIV as the virus, not in a derogatory way, it's just a street way of describing HIV. But people do use the word AIDS as a derogatory term when verbally attacking another person. So there is stigma attached within the cohort of people that we work with that use the HIV or the virus, as people refer it to attack people, which, you know, isn't great, but it is something that happens. We need to keep working with people around destigmatizing HIV. So this is the Zombies and Junkies page. This is the Walking Dead story. Around November 2014, this, I don't know if people remember it, but it was in, I certainly do, went into the papers down in, the local paper down in Metro Herald, but a story around Dunleary Rathdown. So postcards depicting drug users as the Walking Dead have caused uproar as a local business group launched a campaign to close a methadone clinic. The Dunleary Ratepayers Association, I don't even know if they exist anymore, defended its cards, which it gave out to local businesses, asking them to send them to Minister for Health, Leo Varadkar, saying their graphic nature underlines an unfortunate graphic situation. I think they were sorely mistaken. It was disgusting. They used it saying that they were trying to show that methadone was bad and that it was creating these zombies, as they described it, when in fact I found, you know, lots of my colleagues and myself found it disgusting, and that it was attacking the individuals and describing it like that. People forget how truly unwell people are who are living on our streets or living within that cohort of people who inject drugs. You may have abscesses, you may have HIV, you may have hepatitis C, you may have all of the above. You may be hobbling around the streets and people refer to you as junkies and zombies. It's just disgusting. But, you know, we've got to try and challenge these things, and we do, and my colleagues do. So it's an example of a group of people being treated as modern-day social pariahs. That's essentially it. This is actually in date order. It's in 2011. But again, another example of how people are stigmatized. So in his column on February 2011, Ian O'Doherty called for so-called junkies to be sterilized, as he believes it would be better if such people did not reproduce. This article received widespread criticism, as O'Doherty also described drug users as vermin, feral, worthless scumbags, and claimed he would cheer if every junkie died. So that was pretty shocking, you know, and myself and my colleagues in different organisations were angry about this, and certainly, as you can see from the other side, in June of that year, the press ombudsman ordered the article to be removed from the independent.ie website on the grounds that it was deliberately stirring up hatred against a group of people. Rick Lyons, the executive director of Harm Reduction International, said the group was extremely gratified by the decision to remove the offensive article. The decision showed that drug users were entitled to the protections against hate-type speech in the press. But what is the result of all this stigmatization of this particular group of people? Well, this is another article from more recently, from I think it was from June. Can't even read it. May of 2017, and basically the story was that unfortunately this young man was found unresponsive, dying in the streets, and when the person called through, they described it as just another junkie. You know, I mean, when you read the article, you hear about the man's parents, and it's just shocking. But I think that's a consequence of this narrative that's out there about zombies and junkies. So within the population, I suppose what I'm saying is that people feel desensitized towards the group. Others are angry or both, they get fed up with junkies and zombies, as they call them. And they're desensitized to the plight of a cohort of people within society who have major health issues. And so I think individually, and Austin did mention it, he talked about internalization of the problem, and people who use drugs do internalize this, and leading to feelings of shame, which is a barrier to change. And it just compounds their problems. I'm no bleeding heart, and we do have tough love at the Liffey too, and we encourage people. So I think it's really important that we address these issues around stigmatization of that particular client group, so that we can get rid of that shame and that we can move people towards positive change within their lives. Also in the news today, I better rush on. Also in the news today, there was new research from DRHE showing that 92% of the homeless deaths from 2014 were caused directly or indirectly by drugs or alcohol. That's very interesting because there is understandably a lot of empathy for people who die on our streets or in emergency accommodation. Yet when someone dies of an overdose in the toilets of a train station, there is generally not the same show of empathy and outrage. And we could talk about that at length, but there's something, it's the same group of people, but we don't seem to connect the dots. So how can we impact positively and reduce the stigma related to people who use drugs in Ireland? Well, we've talked about challenging the stigmatic language that is being used here, and my colleagues in ISHCA and other organisations like HIV Ireland, we all challenge that as we go through our day-to-day work. But we need a different policy paradigm, and that's why I've mentioned a harm-reducing and rehabilitative approach to the possession of small amount of illegal drugs in Ireland. So just to say, my time is running out, so criminalisation itself is in large part responsible for problems like stigmatisation. In moving to a health-led approach, it is hoped that in time people will accept that to support people who use drugs problematically, it can be recognised that proper care is required rather than criminalisation. Society at large needs a supportive architecture of compassion to enable perceptions to change. So what I'm saying here is that whilst it may not be obvious, when they decriminalised drugs 16 years later, what we found is that we had better health outcomes for drug users, a model of best practice internationally, and it destigmatized drug use amongst the wider population. So that's what I'm going to end on. Decriminalisation in Portugal, 16 years on, as I say, the results have been dramatic. Portugal now has the second lowest rate of overdose deaths in the EU. HIV infections are down significantly. So decriminalisation addresses stigma. Addressing stigma reduces feelings of shame. Reducing shame increases engagement with treatment services. Engagement with treatment services improves health outcomes. Thanks.